Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and you're watching Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. In this episode, I'm talking with Greta Kelly, author of the debut fantasy novel, The Frozen Crown. Violently displaced from the wild beauty of her homeland by a ruthless conqueror, the young princess Askia seeks support from a neighboring nation to the south. But in sun-soaked Vashir, where nobles live lavishly while refugees starve, Askia finds herself a blunt object amongst a court of delicate manners and fragile alliances. The princess urgently needs Vashir's armies to intervene before her country burns. Yet first she must navigate a court that harbors too many enemies, including a vindictive royal son, the hateful mouthpiece of her northern aggressor, and the religious zealots who murdered her parents. Her allies complicate matters too. A friendly prince whose attentions invite scandal, her loyal captain whose devotion barely overshadows his longing, an enigmatic queen who may be mentor or manipulator, and the ghost of her best friend, an apparition only she can see because Askia carries her own carefully guarded secret. She is a witch in a world where magic can be a powerful tool or a death sentence. As every advancing day threatens the annihilation of her army, Askia will face an impossible choice. But will any sacrifice be enough to satisfy two opposing emperors and save her people? The Frozen Crown is the first novel in a duology, available January 12th from Harper Voyager. And Greta, welcome to Fictitious.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to start this off by kind of telling a little story about this. And I'm going to name drop your publicist, Holly Rice.
All right.
Because when this book got brought to me a few months back, Holly brought this to me and was like, oh, here's what this thing is. And I read the initial description. I had a momentary I don't know, because there's a princess and there was courtside drama and there's kind of love triangle-y or quadrangle-y or hexagonally in it. And I was like, that's not usually my bag, right? Like I was like, That's on paper, that doesn't necessarily sound like what I'm into. And, but two things swayed me. One, because Holly championed it and she was like, look, she's like, I understand how it sounds, but she's like, really, really give this thing a try. You're going to like it. And two, because earlier this year, and we're recording this in December of 2020, earlier this year, I read Trisha Levenseller's The Shadows Between Us, which is also a courtside drama. And again, on paper, it doesn't sound like my thing, but it's great. So I was like, okay, Holly sold this really well. I'll give it a try. And I knew, 50 pages into it, that I was into something that I was really, really enjoying. And I really like this book a lot. And so I had to go back to Holly and be like, okay, you're totally right. I now trust your judgment. Let's make this thing happen. So first off, thanks to Holly, because
she's the best.
Yeah, she did a great job of selling that. This is a really nice bit of work for a debut novel. I really enjoy the character work. I like the world a lot. And also, I mean, I think this is about like 480 pages, somewhere in that general vicinity.
Something around there.
Yeah, which is, to me, is kind of like a prime real estate for a tightly plotted yet, very intricate novel. There's no space wasted in this book over those pages too.
We did lots of vigorous editing.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that. But to get started, I mean, I spent a lot of words at the top giving my kind of summary of it, but I want to know like how you pitch this book. What is, when you're telling people, oh, hey, I wrote something, because I know every author has to deal with that. They're like, I'm an author. Like, cool. Have you written anything I've heard? Like, well, it's coming out later, but like, here's what it is. Yeah. How do you describe The Frozen Crown?
Well, your pitch was awesome, but my little elevator pitch that I usually give is The Frozen Crown is about a princess turned general who must leave her armies behind and sail to a foreign court to beg its emperor for aid. But a different kind of war awaits her at court, where one wrong word could mean the end of both her people and her life.
That's very good and very pithy. That's so hard to do.
It's so hard to do.
I mean, anybody who watches this show,
to add, but there's this other thing, and this other thing, and this other thing.
Well, even as I was writing my intro, I was trying to think. I'm like, I mean, I was putting together, and I was like, I'm leaving out like I'm not really talking about, the emperor. I leave out Noriko, like her new friend at court, who's very important. And I felt bad. I was like, oh, I really like Noriko, but I don't have time to talk about her here, stuff like that. It's like so hard to figure out how to take something that's, that has that much going on and distill it. What can you kind of tell me about the world of the Frozen Crown, though? Because, I mean, this is a fantasy world. There is magic here. And a good portion of this novel does take place courtside, but it doesn't start there. So can you kind of give us some context of like what this world looks like, what it feels like, what the political structure is, that kind of stuff?
Sure. So on the surface, it probably feels like most fantasy novels. There's a bunch of kingdoms scattered around this big map and yada, yada, yada. Askia is from a kingdom called Saravesh, which is in the northern hemisphere of this world. And the northern continent has been slowly being taken over by the Rovan Empire. The Rovan has just been going country by country by country, pillaging and taking over and essentially just doing bad stuff. And Askia finds her country has been invaded before the book even begins. You meet her when she's basically already lost the war, and her last hope is to make her way to Bashir, which is the nation that spans the entire southern half of the world, and beg its emperor for help, for aid, and hope that whatever argument she makes is enough to get him interested. So that's the world in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, like, so we have a world in conflict. We have, the courtside political drama. You do have counselors and people begging favor and nobles and yeah, so there are elements that are certainly familiar that, like, if you get in, I don't think it takes too long to understand the structure of the world. Mm-hmm. And before I do these interviews, and I've talked about this on the show before, but I tend to go to like Goodreads and read other advanced reviews because I like to see other people's perspectives, and particularly because like I know I have a limited view of the world, and so I want to see like how other people experience a work because that informs what I come to talk about. And I only saw like one reviewer who said something to the effect of, oh, like I just felt like I got thrust in really fast and I didn't quite know where I was at. And I read that and I had to think, I was like, either this is a person who isn't super experienced with fantasy, or maybe just wasn't paying that close attention. I don't mean to be rude to them on it, but it felt like I knew what was going on really quickly here, and maybe it's just because those structures already lived in my brain. So I was like, okay, cool. Yeah. I know enough to run on here. And it's a question that I ask a lot on this show, which is for people who are writing in science fiction or writing in fantasy or even writing in the real world, like, how much can you depend on the reader to kind of fill in for themselves, because we don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. I mean, you can have a novel like Essa Hansen was just on this show talking about No Fake Gloss, and she reinvented the wheel constantly through that whole book and made life very difficult for herself in the writing, but it's not necessary to do. For you coming into it, were you thinking about uncomplicating some of that so that the reader can get to the meat of the story, which is really the character and drama, because the world building is, of course, important, but it's very secondary to those other things. Is that a consideration you had while you were putting it together?
It definitely was, because, as much as I wanted Askia's world to feel like an actual world and gesturing at places and people that you may never see, but that exist whether or not Askia is alive, you also, you don't want to have the reader feel too much like they've been thrust in the deep end and they have no idea what's going on. So it goes back to that editing process. Lots of things got edited down and edited out. I mean, you have to trust your readers to kind of know what they're getting into, especially in sci-fi and fantasy. So we did what we could not to make it feel like I was reinventing the wheel, as you say, and kind of trusting that people kind of have a basic understanding of how most courts work. And I think for the most part we're successful, but hopefully we'll see what the readers say.
Yeah. Well, it worked for me, I think, and for most of the advanced reviews that I read, it worked for them as well. So I think that'll be a pretty outlier kind of situation for somebody to not grab it. I also think, this is a first-person POV, first-person narrator, and those always lend a quick sense of immediacy and intimacy, I think, because you're right into somebody's mind, you're right into their experiences, you're getting that feel through them, and to a certain extent, they can kind of emotionally inform your view of the world really quickly.
Mhm.
So, I mean, and clearly that's a big benefit of it. Were there other reasons why you chose going with that first person narration over like unlimited third person or something like that? And I'm also curious, like what challenges does it introduce when you only have a limited viewpoint and you have such a complicated ring of characters around you that you can't show from any viewpoint except for Askia's?
Yeah, so funnily enough, this book was actually originally drafted in third. But I would been getting feedback that it felt like the pacing was too slow in third person. So I ended up changing it to first. And I think the immediacy of that helped the pacing kind of keep up. Because I think, especially in court heavy and political heavy fiction, sometimes you have that feeling that things are just moving so slow and nothing's happening. So kind of putting it and ruining it in Askia's point of view so intimately solved that particular issue. You mentioned earlier, I don't think it's much of a secret, she is a death witch. So being able to see ghosts and have ghosts kind of floating around, seeing things for her and reporting back was, I think, the main way that I got around her not being present for everything that happens. So it was kind of like a little trick that just kind of happily worked out that way. I wish I could say I planned it that way, but it just happened.
Happy accidents are part of the creative process,
Yeah.
so I think that's all good. I'm definitely going to hit on the Death Witch stuff later on because I dig that part of it a lot. And I do want to talk about the magic system here too. But you did mention pacing, and so one of the things I think I mentioned, I said earlier that this is tightly plotted, and doesn't feel like there's a lot of wasted space here. I do agree that a lot of times when I've read courtside stuff, it seems to drag around, interpersonal conflicts, but maybe a lack of tension or a lack of raising stakes. I mean, there's some very popular novels that are out right now that I can barely finish because it feels like they just kind of spin their wheels for the soggy middle, And this doesn't do this. I feel like every chapter ends on some kind of game changer. Like there's always a sense of momentum. There's always a sense of Askia has just done something or interacted with somebody or discovered something that is going to be important for her own personal quest in this. So there's always a sense of momentum going forward. You mentioned that, there's a heavy drafting, that you had to change the POV, all that stuff. So what were you doing to kind of manage that pacing? What feedback were you getting from the editors on that? And, just in your process, like what did you do specifically to kind of just pick up the pace and keep it tight?
Yeah, so I did lots and lots of outlines. I'm not naturally an outline person. If I was any good at being a pantser, I would be a pantser, but I'm terrible at it. So here I am outlining. And I think it's just a matter of having really great feedback from people around you and being willing and open to making changes when things aren't working. Writing is far less of a solo process than I think people realize. So not being precious about your work and taking good feedback as it comes in is really important. The other thing that I always tried to keep in mind when I was outlining is using like a mini 3-act structure within each scene. So you have your start, your middle, your end, but your end doesn't necessarily have to be a resolution. And more often it should end like on a climax to kind of keep that momentum going. And the other thing I think is also something that people should keep in mind is that when you're writing, you want each scene to accomplish multiple things. Like you don't want just one scene just for character development. Every single thing should add to as much plot as you can, as well as that character development or whatever piece of world building that you're trying to get at. So you just want to keep that in mind as you're going through. And it takes a lot of editing, and that's just kind of what it is. But if you just keep going and keep working, eventually you'll come up with something that really works.
I'm curious, have you ever read Rachel Aaron's 2K to 10K?
No.
So that book was recommended to me by Andrea Stewart a while back, and I'm reading it now. And she talks about that idea of making your scenes do multiple things, especially when you're trying to cut the word count of a novel. Instead of having like, well, each scene accomplishes one thing, you're going to end up having these 120,000 word door stoppers.
Yep.
Versus like if you can figure out how to make multiple things happen each time, especially if you can think about how to make something that's emotional and something that's plot and something that's world building, happen kind of You can't do it every single time, and you could get really
Right.
overbearing with that. But you're going to get a lot more done, have a lot more momentum, and have a tighter novel. So, so you really echoed something I just read in that, which resonated with me. So I think that's very cool, and I hope people kind of take note of that because I think that's
Yeah.
very valuable. We mentioned that Askia is a death witch. It's worth noting that there are a lot of different, categorically, a lot of different kinds of witches in this world.
Mhm.
The magic is not something that this novel is, I would say, overweighted with. For Askia, it's something that's kind of omnipresent for her, but it's not like she's walking around every scene being like, and then I used my ghost to do a thing, you know? And I don't know why I sing-song that, but, you know, I mean, if you're, you know, if
It was a choice. Just own it.
right, exactly. Like, I mean, honestly, this is who I am as a real person. People don't see it on the show, but I'm the guy dancing in my kitchen, making songs up every day. So this is just who I am, people. But yeah. So, like, what is that magic system? What are these different kinds of witches? What place does it occupy in this world? Because it's very controversial and potentially very dangerous to even like possess this kind of magic. So, what does that look like?
Yeah, so in this particular world, you're born with the magic, and it's kind of like you said, only a few people have it. It's maybe 10% of the total population are born with magic. And there are 7 different types. There are the 4 typical elemental types: earth, air, water, fire. But then there are 3 additional spirit magics, is what I end up calling them, which is healing, death magic, and then mind magic, which encompasses things like being able to tell the truth from a lie. Um, as to why it's so taboo is a little bit more complicated because, in a large part, that depends on where you're from or where you're living. In the northern part of the world, where Askia is originally from, magic isn't necessarily seen as a bad thing. It's just dangerous to be known as a witch because of the rise of the Rovan Empire. Everyone kind of knows at this point that when Rovan armies invade, the witches are taken, and no one really knows what happens to them, but they know it can't be any good. And added to that is this added worry that the Emperor of Rovan, Radovan, may have figured out a way to steal magic from witches, making it even more dangerous to be known as a witch. So you come into the story seeing Askia, knowing that she can see these ghosts, but she never mentions it, and you kind of have to figure out that, oh, she's keeping it a secret. People don't actually know that she's a death witch. And then when she goes to Vashir, I mean, for most of Vashir's history, it's not been a big deal to be a witch. Her father, for instance, was a very well-known and very well-respected healer. But in recent years, it's become dangerous because there's this new religion that's risen up who believe that witches are kind of like a perversion of godly power, and they think that all witches should be killed. In both instances, the reaction to magic, both in the north and in the south of the world, it's kind of an expression of jealousy. Some people, when they see something that they can't have, they will do whatever they can to attain it. Other people will see that same thing and think, well, if I can't have it, no one can.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the world and the magic that Askia finds herself having to kind of navigate.
There's 2 things that I really thought were cool in what you have attached to the magic system. One is that so this religious group that kind of actively sort of hunt witches witches and that killed Askia's parents in the past. They put her to the question, I think is their sort of phrasing for it, as far as checking to see if she has magic when she was young. And the nature of the death magic is that it doesn't manifest in a physical or visible way, so they couldn't find it. So they think that she is not a witch, unlike her parents. So she's been allowed to kind of skate by, even though she suffered a lot to beat that question. And I think that's an interesting note in the story that there is a sort of hidden nature to her magic. And the other thing I think is interesting is that the magic also seems to be kind of based around in this religious system that you have this thing called the two-faced god, which has a day lord and lady night. And this religious group worships this god, but sort of only one half of it and not the other.
Right.
And I liked the way that was set up, and it matches a lot of things in the story. I think that like you do have some clearly detailed world building going on, but there's not a lot of exposition dumps. There are places where it's doled out in conversation, or Askia will kind of give us little bits and pieces of things. But I think it's very rare to kind of get hit over the head with those elements. When you're tracking all that stuff, I mean, you have several different nations, lots and lots of characters, lots of things that feel like there's things happening in the background, right? This is like any good story. It's not just that the world revolves around the main character, there's a lot of things happening that she can't see and has to pick up on. How are you tracking that? How are you keeping that organized, especially as you go draft to draft and you make changes? Like, what's your organizational method to keep track of those things?
Madness, just madness. No, I have so many notebooks and Word files and OneNote pages, and I wish I could say that I had like a dedicated binder that was just the Bible for the world, but I don't. OneNote has been a very helpful. I have Scrivener. I'm afraid of using it for the most part, but I do use it to help me outline and keep track of things like that. But mostly it's just keeping a lot of things written in notebooks that I make sure I never lose.
That would definitely be important because, yeah, especially because it's a duology. And
right.
I mean, it's worth noting, like, I mean, I went back and like I looked at your Twitter feed and I saw you announce like the book deal for this, like I think in early 2019.
Mm-hmm.
And so this book is coming out in the beginning of 2021. So you skipped 2020 and that's brilliant. That was a wise move. We should have all just hit fast forward on this year. But so you've had like 2 years since and probably change, you know, because you can't always just talk about things as soon as, you know, the deal happens.
Right.
But so I'm going to guess that you either are already well deep into the second book in the duology, if not already done with it. Like, where are you at in that?
Yeah. So we are just about to start copy edit soon on the second book. And right now we're fingers crossed will be published sometime in fall of 2021. So it'll be a really short turnaround for readers who finish Frozen Crown. For the wait for the second book is only going to be a couple months.
I think that's been an interesting new move in publishing because, I mean, classically, especially like fantasy and stuff, you'd see a novel a year, maybe.
Right.
You know, if you're a Patrick Rothfuss, maybe you get a book ever. Who knows?
God, that hurts. Don't.
But it seems like a lot of the deals have happened lately where they're picking up and they're like, okay, we want this. If it's a duology, it's a trilogy, but we're going to like wait a little bit until most of the books are done or we know that we can crank them out. I feel like the pace of readership that, particularly in the influence of like self-publishing and things like, you know, Kindle Limited, those kind of worlds where like voracious readers devour things, where they've also in finding that there's a certain audience that only starts buying a series after the entire thing is out, you know, which is not great for the ecosystem
for writers, but
right. But I think that move now, when, you know, Harper Voyager can say, oh, here's the first book and hey, it's going to be like 6 months till the second one, right? Like you don't have to stress, like it's on its way. There's a lot of readership that I think will breathe a sigh of relief then and be like, okay, cool, I can invest in this. Because I'm always afraid, you know, that George R.R. Martin's going to put out a book series and then never finish it. You know, that kind of thing. I mean, it's a real concern. So, I mean, I'm not the kind of person who waits for everything to appear before it comes out, but I do understand that that feeling a little bit.
Yeah. Well, we've all been burned before. But yes, rest assured, the second book is written. We just have to do the grammar and spelling checks and stuff like that.
The easy stuff.
The easy stuff.
Right.
Wink, wink.
Yeah. Easy stuff for somebody else to do, right?
Right.
Let's swing it back around and talk about Askia here, because I mean we've talked about her place in the plot, but not a whole lot about her as a character yet. And she is our first person POV. She is extremely central to all this stuff. What can you tell me about the personality of her kind of history in the world? We've talked a little bit as far as her parents and the magic and stuff, and just kind of what motivates her in this. Because I do want to know, like, if people are like me and they see the word princess, they're immediately like, ooh, cringe, like, oh, what's that mean? And
she does not belong in Disney, don't worry.
Right. Yeah. There's no songs. This is not Frozen. It's the Frozen Crown. Very different thing. Not that there's anything wrong with a good musical break, but yeah, like, what can you kind of tell me about her and what is driving her in this story?
Yeah. So Askia was for a long time a woman without a home. Her mother was this heir to the kingdom of Saravesh, which is where Askia is now the queen of. But her mother fell in love with a commoner. And while Askia's father was a well-known and powerful witch, the fact that they eloped basically meant exile for the entire family. So she wasn't raised by any means as someone being groomed for rule. She's very rough and ready. her family spent most of her youth traveling around Bashir from one battlefield to the next. Basically, wherever a healer might be needed, they would go. It was a very kind of transitory upbringing, and in a lot of ways, her parents were her home. But like we said earlier, her parents were killed before the book begins. And that loss, I think, informs so much of her character. Askia, like I said, she didn't have a home. Her parents were her home, and losing them destroyed her in a lot of ways. So her desire to find a place in the world and to claim a home and protect it come hell or high water is, I think, the thing that motivates her more than anything else, and in some ways, even her own personal happiness.
So a couple of things I think are really cool about Askia as a character. One is that because of that transient nature, she's seen a lot more of the world than a lot of the other people that she encounters, including there's a scene where she is interacting with the Emperor of Vashir and starts talking about where she's from and other beautiful parts of his empire. And he has to stop and go, I've never seen them, because he never leaves the palace or he never leaves this area. And I thought that was very interesting. And I think it's also worth noting that Askia is this character who has grown up into her teenage years and into a young woman, surrounded by soldiers, surrounded by fighting people, surrounded by people who are concerned about living and dying, not niceties.
Right.
And she's a physical person herself. She can hold her own. Not the world's greatest fighter, but certainly not one to be underestimated as well.
Right.
But I think in some hands, you end up with, like, you either have the dainty princess or you have the tomboy. And that's not where she fits into. She's still feminine. A young woman who thinks of herself as kind of, I don't know, old soul is such an awful phrase, but like, but she is. But
she's seen some shit.
Right, exactly. She is different than her years would, necessarily tell somebody. But I like that you didn't try to reinforce any part of those nature of her in any way. Like, she can be feminine, she can be a fighter, she can, have a bit of a raw way of speaking with people occasionally, because she doesn't always interface real well with polite court.
Yeah, if she could have bitch slapped her way through court, she would have.
Absolutely. That brings me to something that I really liked. And so I have this thing that when I'm reading a book, that it doesn't happen in every novel, but I think about sometimes, and I always think of this as the sort of author honesty test. There's a moment in the story where a character gets faced with a decision, and it can be huge or it can be something relatively small, but it's a moment where I go, okay, here's where I get almost nervous leading up to it, where I'm like, this is where the author either allows the character to act how they've been set up, how they feel real, regardless of how the chips fall afterwards, or they do something that's easy for the plot or feels like the genre or that feels like it's expected, in its niche or whatever. And I will DNF out of a book so hard when those things happen. And it's happened a lot where there's moments where, like, I cannot trust you as an author anymore because you told me who the person, or you showed me who the person was, and then you had them do something that didn't feel real to them. That moment happens in this novel where it comes up to it, and it's a simple thing, which is just Askia goes to meet the queen, or at least the primary queen, because there's sort of a menagerie, this sort of harem of queens, but she's the one who matters. And Ozura, and Askia has to interact with that queen and a couple of other members of the menagerie. And I don't want to give any more about that scene away, other than I had this moment where I was like, this is where I learn if I trust you or not. Which is like, is Askia going to act the way I think she would based off of everything that I know? Yeah. Or will she demur in this scene? And thankfully, obviously, I finished the book. She acted the way that I thought felt real, that was angry and frustrated and not caring about what the whims of the court were or what the necessity of nicety was. She acted like her. And I walked away from that scene, or in my head, walked away with Askia in it, being like, yes, okay, this is the person I'm rooting for. This is the person who I'm on board with, because I'm 100% telling those people to go F themselves. So that works for me.
I'm so glad you liked that scene, because funnily, it's one of the scenes that has changed the least in the entire book. It was so much fun to write. Yeah, it's probably the worst way that Askia could have introduced herself to Ozura, but it's just so true to her character. Like we've been saying, Askia is not a born politician. She was raised on battlefields and politics, and really generally just like using her words does not necessarily come naturally to her. Um, and I think part of that, especially early on in the book, she kind of falls into that trap of thinking she knows what it means to be a strong woman, thinking that strength is purely in her own physicality, and slightly valuing more manly or male traits or stereotypically male traits over traditionally feminine ones. But her ability to swing a sword is really only so useful in the court of Ashir. I mean, Ashir literally comprises half the world. And so she really has to learn how to control her anger as a part of her own character growth and know when to express herself as bluntly as possible and know when to kind of rein it in. And it's hard for her because she's not someone who naturally likes to compromise and give up control in certain places. But it's something that she has to do because she, as old of a soul as she is, she's still very much learning what kind of woman she wants to be, just as she's still learning what kind of queen she wants to be. And I think as the novel progresses, she really has to figure out whether those two identities will be able to coexist.
It's worth noting, too, that this novel doesn't hit you over the head with like gender role stuff, but there are certainly clashing ideologies within it because the court, the council, for the empire is very much all male. The queen and the menagerie have influence, but they sit off to the side, and they know that their position as wives to the emperor are political appointments for the most part.
Right.
There's
Right.
other elements
Yeah.
in there. But Askia's nation, I mean, the group of men that come with her, her own guard, her own warriors, never question a moment of her placement as their leader, as her ability to fight in any way. Like, it's just not there. She is
Yeah.
one of them. She's just the first, among them, in the hierarchy of leadership.
Right.
And the way she interacts with them, the way that they will laugh and kid with her and still defer to her, but also have like that kind of personal dynamic is very refreshing. And I think the interplay between those scenes of like being stuck in this very rigid kind of, social hierarchy and then switching back to the way they speak. And then you have this other prince named Iskander. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, you're saying it right.
Okay, so when Iskander shows up, he is a royal son. He's immediately friendly with her because he's met Askia when they were kids,
Right.
and he kind of bucks norms a little bit without maybe not intentionally, but more just because he's kind of a cavalier, freewheeling, like, I'm just going to show up at
Right.
your room at night and we'll hang out. And everybody's like, that's
What's the
super
problem?
scandalous. Right. No, yeah, no big deal. And Iskander coming in, and this, kind of segue into something else I want to talk about here, and I mentioned earlier on, is that there is heavy romantic subplots in this story, and you don't make it easy on yourself because it's not just a romance or a love triangle. I feel like you could make the argument that it's like a romantic hexagon where not everybody has those feelings.
Flow chart.
Right, exactly. Like there's very much a, put the strings here to here to here and kind of figure out. And I don't want to give too much of that away because that is part of the fun of developing out the story. But when you're putting something like that into a novel like this, how are you approaching that? How do you tracking that? How do you balance it? When you're like, here's the main drama of the story. Here's the political conflicts. Here's the stuff that's happening in the background. Here's the magic that's going on to it. Oh yeah, and all these people are kind of messed up with each other and having a lot of complicated feelings. And even when I was like, oh wow, this is a lot to deal with, like you throw in a big time curveball as far as an interest in Askia from somebody real significant, about 2/3 through the novel, that only makes things weirder yet, right? So like, what were your considerations for that? How do you balance that? How are you kind of making sure that fit with the flow of the story?
Yeah. Well, part of the fun of being a writer is just making your characters as miserable as possible. so that was one consideration. I think for the whole, it was all just about moving the plot forward and also about what felt true for these characters. I think given our conversation so far, it probably won't be a surprise when people find out that Iskander kind of has a thing for Askia, because he's literally never met anyone like her before. He's never met a woman who was able to be so open and free and honest and true to herself as she is. So it was kind of natural for him to have those feelings. Askia has seen a lot of stuff, like we've said, and Iskander's kind of this, good time himbo kind of mama's boy. So it makes sense that maybe she's not super into him in the same way that he's into her. And it's funny because in earlier drafts, I had her almost feeling guilty about this. And my editor, bless him, was like, no, her lack of feeling for Iskander shouldn't make her feel guilty at all. That's not her problem. That's his problem.
Right.
So thankfully, thankfully he said that, and I was able to kind of course correct. But yeah, I mean, this is a political intrigue, and political drama is a big part of this story. So the possibilities of political marriages were kind of always on the table for Askia. The juxtaposition, of duty and desire is kind of a main theme of the book. But I wanted to make sure that it didn't feel predatory. I didn't want Askia to feel, and it just wouldn't have been true to her character to be in the situation where not only is it a loveless marriage, but the guy is like a complete abusive jerk. Like, she just wouldn't have accepted something like that. So, but in an odd way, the possibility that there could be happiness in that kind of a union made it harder for her to say yes to it, because part of her, I think, is just used to being miserable and slightly more comfortable with that. So it was kind of an interesting interplay of just really just torturing my characters, because that's just fun.
We have to suffer to get to the good stuff, right? Like that's
right.
that should be the theme for 2020. Suffer to get the good stuff.
We hope.
Yeah. Alongside Askia, we've mentioned a lot of these different characters. You mentioned Radovan, who is the opposing emperor, who is stealing magic and is, I will say, gone through wives because they don't survive being married to him. But he's distant. He's a character that's his work is happening in the background, although there is a mouthpiece for him operating in the court there. You have Azura, the queen, who is not necessarily receptive to her to begin with, but is also potentially one of her greatest allies. We mentioned Iskander. The character that I find really fascinating in the story, and who gets the least amount of dialogue because he's dead, is Vitali. Because I really, really, really like this element of the story. I like that Askia has this death magic. I like that her best friend, who is dead, is basically kind of following her around and helping her out. But that situation's super complicated too, and I don't know how much we want to dig into why he's dead. But it happens very early in the story.
Right.
But I think we'll save that one for
you
people.
won't have to wait long to find out.
Right. You get into it quickly. But for you, I mean, you mentioned that like having this character be kind of floating around in this world gives her some additional abilities to see some things she wouldn't be able to otherwise. Is that something that happened in the drafting stage? Did he develop out more? Did you always intend for that to be kind of an important part of her like toolkit, essentially? Or, how did that come to be?
Yeah, so I knew early on that he was going to be dead. But it kind of evolved as the story came along, where he just became more and more central to the plot, and maybe not in the most obvious way, because you're right, he doesn't have a lot of dialogue, but his very presence is kind of a touchstone or a reminder to Askia of why she's doing everything that she's doing, and a reminder that, yeah, she's, in court, she's hanging with these princes and this queen and doing all these wheeling and dealing, but her people are still depending on her, and she's supposed to be doing all this for Saravesh. And I think it helped kind of bring everything home and move the plot forward and in kind of like a propulsive way, if that makes any sense at all.
Absolutely, yes. You touched on earlier that you've kind of tried to operate on this idea of like using like almost like 3-act structure within scenes, which I think makes a lot of sense as far as just making things work. And you've also said that you're not naturally a plotter, but you had to become that. Are you using a specific system? Is there something that like, that you have kind of adhered to as far as like, I bring this up all on the show, where there's like the Save the Cat or 7-point plotting system, or like there's dozens of different ideas out there. Is there any one of those that you actually use? Is it something you kind of figured out on your own? Like, what's your methodology?
Yeah, so I definitely had to learn as I went. This was the first book that I had ever written with any sense of an outline. And I mean outline in like the broadest terms. Basically, I just sat down one day and like chapter by chapter, this is what happens, which is not what anyone means when they think about story structure.
Yeah.
But as the drafts progressed, I found that it was helpful to outline between drafts so that I could get a sense of what I thought the book was versus what the book actually was. And it just happened. I landed on the 7-point structure, and that's what I used more formally to draft and write book 2. So I think that's probably the closest sort of plotting method that you could say I used in this book.
Is that like the Dan Wells method? Is that kind of what you mean?
The Dan Wells one. Yeah.
That one has definitely been a over the years of doing this show, as I hear more people talking about it now, because I don't think I'd even heard of it maybe like a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
So it does seem to be kind of catching on with people. And you mentioned, and I'm going to go into a panic spiral as we talk about this, I think. But you mentioned OneNote and Word and Scrivener and notebooks and various other things here.
Yes.
I'm terrified to ask this question, Greta, but what are you writing in? And like, how is this coming together?
I'm a Word person. Yeah, I am such a Luddite. My husband actually works in IT, and he jokes that I married him just for tech support, which I won't confirm or deny. But yeah, I just have one giant Word document that I revise, and occasionally it crashes, so I have it saved in like 12 different places.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Shannon Chakrabarty was on the show a couple years ago, and she was talking about writing, at that point, I think it was Kingdom of Copper. And she was like, yeah, you discover that that Word's really only built to handle up to about 150,000 words, or not 150, like 110,000 words. And past that,
you turn on track changes.
Right. Well, now I was going to say, because I mean, that is like Duncan Swan was on the last episode, and he talked about how Word is great for working with editors because you can do all that change tracking, but a little hard on your system once you have that big a document, because that computer is just not designed to eat that much RAM and have that much going on in it. So, but again, this is where would you say this book lands? Is this 80,000 words, somewhere around that general vicinity?
Probably, oh gosh, it's been so long since I've even looked at the word count. Probably closer to 95, 100 area. It's not super long for a fantasy novel. So,
well, I know like the general like rule of thumb is that 80 to 100 is your standard kind of mainstream novel. Fantasy can go like lean towards like to 120 because people do like those big books, and larger yet if there's very specific types of epic fantasy where those readers are like like I want the thing that like I can
Speaking of Shannon Chakrabarty.
Right, exactly. I'm like, those books are behind me back here. And,
I love those books. But
Empire of Gold is they're pretty big. They're pretty solid. I get scared of the large books these days because of the sheer volume of stuff I have to read for the show. Whereas other people, they're like, they see that thing that's this big and they're like, ooh, there it is. That's what I was going for. I mean, that wraps up what I've got here. What I said at the beginning was, I really, really enjoyed this book. I like the flow of it. I like the way it moved. I really enjoyed this character and the world that's wrapped around her. I always appreciate when I get books on this show that maybe are not the thing I would have picked up in the store necessarily based on, it's not being marketed directly necessarily right at me. Right.
Right.
But like I said before, like your publicist made a good case for it. She was totally right. It's good to know I've got a pub that I can trust their input because Holly hasn't steered me wrong yet. And I think that this is that kind of thing where people should spread outside their genre a little bit if it's not necessarily the niche that they would normally land in, because the characters are so good, because the world is so well executed. And again, it doesn't read like a debut novel. This reads like a seasoned novelist, and I think that's very, very cool. This book is going to come out, what did I say? Like it's January
12th.
January 12th. Where should people be following you so they can keep up on the next stories that you write, so that they'll know when the next novel is coming, and just so they can keep up on everything that is the Greta Kelly experience?
So I'm most active on Twitter and Instagram, Greta K. Kelly. I also have a website, gretakkelly.com, which I update occasionally. But Twitter is probably the easiest place to find me.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I hope people check out The Frozen Crown. It definitely goes into one of my highlights of, comes out in 2021. I read in 2020 because I'm special. But it's definitely one of the ones I have most enjoyed this year. And Greta, thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
Thank you so much for having me. This was awesome.